Okay, so in this video we'll address the add operation, which is kind of involved, so I'll try to keep it short here, but I'm just going to start out by running this application, and I'm going to add a new student. First of all, the student ID I'm going to skip, and I'll tell you why. That is an auto number in the underlying database. So we'll look at that in a moment, but I'm going to type myself as a student and save. Okay, so it looks like I'm in there, and you can rest assured I am in the database now. What you notice is I don't see my student ID. The record has been committed to the database, but I'm still not seeing the student ID. So that's a setup for our discussion of what we call an identity query, which we'll talk about in this video. But okay, so basically let's just take a look. Why did we skip the ID? Because here's the setup of the table, and this is very typical of a database where you have this. That's called a surrogate key. When the database handles the primary key values, it's generating those numbers automatically, so the user doesn't have to be thinking of numbers and keeping track of the numbers. So this is an auto number, which means when we're inserting records, we are not going to provide that ID because the database is handling it. The database management system, in this case Access, is taking care of that. Okay, so basically I'm going to go to the data layer. And this was just a temporary, basically, I'll leave that there for the moment, and then we'll talk about it in a sec. Okay, so we're opening the connection. This is, by the way, the add new student to database method in our data layer. And we have a student coming through the door called S. We're opening the connection. We're setting up an insert statement. Notice how we are skipping the ID. The ID is none of our business. That's an auto number, so we're skipping it. 2 question marks. Okay, one for the first name, one for the last name. Order matters because we went first name, last name. So this one's the first name, this one's the last name. That's important. And then we have our command object, that vehicle to carry the SQL statement to the database. Now 2 parameters, one for the first name, one for the last name, these 2 parameter objects. And then very importantly, when you're adding those parameter objects to the command object, parameters collection, order is everything. Okay, in this case, first name comes first, last name comes last, because that's the way we set it up in our insert statement. You have to be very mindful of the order. Okay, executing the query. Now this was temporary. I'm going to delete that. We are actually keeping the connection open because we're going to do what we call an identity query. To avoid that situation where I've added the new student and the ID is blank, I want to be able to look into the database as soon as that record is added and see what the new ID is and provide that to the user so the user can see it. So I have the identity query here. It's just a method. I'm calling it getNewRecordID. All right, and we have a string, just an empty string here, which I'm calling new ID. And this is some unusual syntax. This is how you perform an identity query. You have the 2 @ symbols and the word identity. Select the identity from that table. That's going to get us the next number in the primary key, auto generator, whatever, the sequence in that table. Okay, so all we have to do is package that up in a command object, and then we call upon our student reader, our data reader, to read that data out of the database. Just because we're not reading lots and lots of data, all we're reading is one little number. Just because we're not reading tons and tons of data like we were in the first video, doesn't mean that you don't use the data reader. We're just reaching in, we're reading a value, and what we're going to get is we're calling upon the read method. It's not in a loop because there's not lots and lots of data, so it's just one quick read, and what will be returned is that number, that next number, in a tiny array of 1 cell. Just a tiny array of 1 cell with an index of 0. So that's what this is all about. We're saying reach into that tiny array of 1 cell with an index of 0, convert it to a string, put it in the new ID. That's our new ID in a string format, which we're about to display in a text box. And then we're closing up the reader, which will also close the connection object, and we're returning that new ID to the form. So here, it all goes down in the save, right? So basically, what's happening, oh, let me uncomment this. This is where we're displaying the new one, the new ID in the text box. Okay, so what we're doing, remember we isolated the current student in the binding source. Every time we land on a new student, we are, oh, no, you know what, I'm getting ahead of myself. When we do an add, let me run this. Okay, watch this. I'm going to add a new student. Okay, what happens? Empty text boxes clear out. What's going on there? Let's take a look. Okay, so here in the add button, I have adding a Boolean up at the top to decide whether we're adding or editing. You're familiar with that technique by now. I'm creating a brand new empty student. Empty student. And I'm adding that empty student to our list of students. So in addition to Walt Disney and Marilyn Monroe and Elvis and all these other students in the table, or in the list, I should say, they're not in the, well, yeah, they are in the table, but in the list, I've got this empty student at the end of the list. And then when I move, because the binding source is bound to that list, when I do a move last, I land on that empty student, and it clears out the text boxes. Okay? Landing on that empty student will clear out those text boxes. So then it all goes down in the save. The current student, so at this point the user is going to type in a new name, like I typed in my name, and the current student is the student that we're just currently looking at, and we're going to say, okay, the current student is whoever's, the first name is whatever's in that text box, whatever the user has typed into that text box for the first name and the last name. And so we're adding new in this case, which we'll talk about the edit maybe in the next video. But here, we're calling upon our add new student to database. All right, we're just passing the current student with a new first name and the new last name that the user just typed in. Okay, and we already looked at that in the data layer and saw that that'll just insert that student with the parameters and the question marks, all that. And then we're calling the identity query. This is to that identity query that we just looked at to get the new ID and display it in the student ID text box. And then we'll set that flag variable to adding new back to false. So now that the identity mechanism is in place, let me add myself again, and you'll see we'll get the new ID this time. Saving. Okay, there it is.